So welcome to this Intelligence Squared Plus event with Alastair Campbell, Downing Street Press Secretary to Prime Minister Tony Blair, before politics, political editor at The Mirror, currently editor-at-large of The New European, works for GQ magazine, also an ambassador for Mind, Time to Change, and plenty of other mental health charities. And here's the all-important cover shot. That's the book, Living Better, How I Learned to Survive Depression. So we're going to go on for about an hour. About half of it I'll be in discussion with Alastair, and then you can get your questions in at any time, and it'll be a Q&A for the second half of it. So just click on the Ask Question button under the video screen, type your question in there. If you want your name mentioned, then type it into the box, press send, and off you go. So, Alastair, so when I read your very brief CV there, you've achieved so much. Have you done that despite suffering from depression, or maybe slightly because of your suffering from depression, or a bit of both, or is it a fatuous question?
I don't think it's fatuous at all. I think it's a very astute observation, because I would say because of, in part, not necessarily because of my depression, but because of what the, if you like, the spectrum of my mental health gives me in terms of productivity and creativity. I talk a lot in the book. One of the reasons I write about mental health so much is I don't want people to see it as all negative. I get a lot of energy most of the time. I have a lot of productivity and creativity in me most of the time. And I also get these, you know, sometimes quite spectacular depressive crashes. And Stephen Fry, who's quoted on the cover of the book, he was once asked whether, if there was he was given a red button, and if he pressed that red button, his bipolar disorder would vanish, whether he would press it. And he thought long and hard, and he said no. And if you said to me, would you prefer never to know depression again? I would say definitely. But if you said that the price for that would be that you also would never know the real kind of buzz of drive and energy and dynamism that you often feel, and which maybe is the antidote to that, then I would struggle to say, yeah, I could lose that. So maybe I've reached a point of thinking I can't live without both, and therefore I might as well try my best to do so.
But you must have spoken to psychiatrists, as I have, who say, yeah, you know, you've got issues, but look, I deal every day with people who can't bath themselves, can't tie their own shoelaces. You know, yet you are high functioning. No, they're not demeaning your suffering or people like you, but there is still that aspect to it, isn't there, that you are a high functioning?
Yeah, but I think that you know, I've spoken to lots of psychiatrists, both in terms of the research that I've done for the book, and also psychiatrists that have looked after me at different points in my life. And one in particular that, you know, who's in the book a lot, David Sturgeon, that I've now been seeing for 15 years, and I've put in the book a lot of the kind of stuff that we've done together. And I don't think the great thing about psychiatrists, I think they know, the good ones, that they don't differentiate between rich and poor, black and white, male and female, young and old. If they're confronted with somebody who is signaling what they recognize as symptoms of really deep depression, then they're just going to try to deal with that and address that. And look, I say in the book, I know people. I've had people in my family, like my brother who had schizophrenia, my cousin who took his own life. I've got people in my family who've had way worse mental health conditions than I have. But I think I don't think a psychiatrist grades them like that. When you're sitting there in front of a psychiatrist and they're trying to get to the bottom, as you are, of something that is profoundly affecting your mood for the worse, and therefore the people around you, then they just want to help you to try and sort that out.
But looking at your family history, would you describe what you have as being, you had a predisposition to it, or was it a predetermination? Are there any circumstances ever which you weren't going to have some kind of serious issue along the lines you had?
Oh yeah, I don't think there is. If I, there's a chapter on genetics in the book, and if I had to kind of sum it up in one line, we all have genes, and we all have therefore a lot of influence from people that have created us. But there's no automaticity in something like mental illness. Just because your dad my dad wasn't, but say my dad had been an alcoholic, doesn't mean that I am. My two parents, I say in the book, my mother, when she died, if we sat around after she died, all these people, friends and family, and people were asked to say, if there's one word that you would use to describe her, what would it be? Everybody said happy. Everybody. Because she was one of the happiest people I've ever known. And yet she had eldest son, schizophrenia, second son, as I say in the book, all sorts of unaddressed psychological issues. He died very young as well. Me, I've had psychosis, I've had depression, I've had addiction issues. My sister, who had an eating disorder at one point in her life. So I don't know. I don't think it is genetic. And I think that every family will know somebody within that family who has got a mental health problem, and they'll also know somebody in that family who doesn't. So I don't know. I don't think it is genetic.
But was there any intervention then that could have happened with you that might have set you on a different path? At any stage, it might have been a psychiatrist, it might have been something at school, I don't know, something your parents might have done or not done.
Yeah, I'm sure there would have been. But I don't know. You see, I'll give you an example. When I was at school, I say in the book, my first warning for excessive drinking from a doctor was when I was 17. Now, at that time, I don't believe, because kids are very good at hiding things from their parents. I think my parents might have known I had a drink. They might have known. They did know I was kind of smoking fags out the back, out the window of my bedroom every night, whatever. But I don't think they'd have thought I had a problem. Now, that doctor was warning me. I completely ignored that warning because I thought, well, I'm only 17. I hardly have a drink problem at 17. I didn't really confront having a drink problem until I was 28. Why did that happen? Because I had a psychotic breakdown. I was arrested and I was put in a hospital. And I had a psychiatrist sitting there telling me I had a real problem. Now, it was only that kind of sense of, this is a bit rock bottom. You've just been arrested. You've been chucked in the back of a van. You're in a police cell for a few hours before they can get you a doctor. I had to do something. I had to face up to it. So I could have made lots of different choices along that way, but I didn't. And likewise, when with depression, I don't think I really have, and I say the subtitle of the book is How I Learned to Survive Depression, not beat it, not deal with it forever, to survive it. I think I did that in part because, and again, it was a very, very low moment, 2005, I described the details, I was beating myself up physically, literally out on Hampstead Heath, walking with Fiona, feeling such a sort of pain and a rage inside that I started hitting myself in the face, and I was like really hitting myself. And that was when both of us we looked at each other and realized, you can't do this on your own. You've got to go and get help. And that was a turning point. Now, since then, I have made different choices. But your question, was there anything on the way? I don't know. Because, sorry.
Well, no, it's interesting. So you kind of, you had a shot across your bows from a doctor when you were 17 about drinking, but you needed to absolutely bottom out at 28 with your psychotic episode, before you or anyone else was taking it seriously.
Oh, no, listen, other people were taking it seriously. In fact, Fiona, my partner, has written a chapter in the book, and she says in that, and this is why I think employers are so important in this, she said she was so worried about me, not just the drinking, but she phoned my editor at the time. I was the news editor. She phoned him and said, look, I'm absolutely petrified. I think Alastair is on the verge of a complete nervous breakdown. And the guy said to her, basically said, don't be so silly. He's really working hard. He's incredibly energetic. His work's amazing, da 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 da. And she said that she was made to feel completely stupid and small. And of course, I made her feel the same, because I was saying, don't stop nagging me. Stop, what are you going on about? I'm fine. Leave me alone. What's wrong with sitting in a chair all night in your coat, drinking a bottle of scotch? Please, can you just leave me alone? And so other people, my friends, I had really good friends who were saying, we're really worried about you, but you just push them away. And look, I've seen this generationally. This is maybe slightly going against what I said in the previous answer. I say in the book, we've got 3 children, and Callum, one of our sons, he's a recovering alcoholic, and he had an alcohol problem in a way more serious than mine and younger than mine, in that he's not drunk now for 7 years, and he's only just quite recently turned 30. Now, when he was clearly sort of, on the spiral with alcohol, I just didn't matter what we said. And he hit a rock bottom as well. He got into trouble. We basically said to him, you have got to go into this rehab place. He'd been before, but it didn't work. And we essentially said, you're going in and you're not coming out until you're fixed. And he did. Yeah.
Now, I was struck by something you said. I'll ask you about how Fiona deals with you in a minute, but it strikes me that if you, the situation you're in, and indeed your son's in, you need people around you who care for you, who love you, but they're not going to do you any favours if they don't draw you a line somewhere. If they just absorb everything, then they'll end up being almost sort of enablers, facilitators of it. And you did draw a very firm line for Callum, didn't you? The night when he came back late, the story, I found it harrowing to read in the book. If you just explain about that.
Well, it was harrowing, and it was one of the that was, for all the difficulties I've had, both with my mental health, with my brother's mental health, for all the difficulties and pressures I've had in my professional and political life, that was the worst period of both my and Fiona's life, I think. Because we both felt so helpless. And actually, it was my psychiatrist, David, I was talking to him about Callum, and I felt useless. I felt I wasn't helping him. I thought I ought to be able to help him more because I'd been through something similar. I felt I was probably making it worse. I was doing all the things I know you shouldn't do, like saying, just stop drinking, just don't do it. All that stuff, I was doing it. And David said, exactly as you said, he said, look, at the moment, he thinks he can do whatever he wants. You give him rules, you say there are things he can and can't do, and you let him break them. I said, well, what do you mean? He said, well, look, you've told him that he cannot come into the house if he's drunk, but you let him into the house when he comes home drunk. You can't do that. And I said, well, okay, that's all very well, but what if he knocks on the door and I don't let him in because he's drunk, and he goes away and he gets hit by a bus? Or he falls in the canal. And I remember David said, well, that might happen, and you can't stop that from happening. But what happens if you let him in every time, as he knows he can just keep going and doing the same? And one night, not many weeks later, exactly that scenario happened, that he knocked on the door, he rang the bell, he'd lost his keys, he'd lost his phone, he'd lost track of time, he didn't know what was going on. And I said to him, sorry, Callum, you're not coming in. I'm sorry, I'm not letting you in the house. And it was really cold, and he said, what am I supposed to do? Walk the streets, just whatever? I said, I don't know, but we've said we'll support you, we'll look after you, you can live here, but not if you're going to come home in the state that you're in. So I'm sorry. And I turned and I shut the door, and I literally sort of collapsed in a heap. And the rest of the night, Fiona and I just, but you could argue that David was right, but equally, I know he could have wandered off and got hit by a bus. So
it's a hell of a gamble to take.
It is.
How has Fiona deployed that kind of tough love with you? Where is she draw a line for you?
Well, she is pretty amazing. I say in the book that, of all the I've had many strokes of luck in my life, and she was the biggest one, because she stood by me when I was really bad, when I had my breakdown in my 20s. And we'd actually not been getting on. I'd moved into a hotel. I'd become really kind of unbearable to live with. and she came and looked after me when I was in hospital in Scotland with her dad. And then I think for a long period, we both dealt with that part of it very, very badly. Fiona's written a chapter in the book where she says that for years, she blamed herself. If I was depressed and I was lying in a heap on the sofa, it must be because of her. And of course, if you're the depressed person, that's kind of quite convenient as well. And, you know, I feel bad about this, but I played into that. I was quite happy for her to sort of share that sense of burden and blame. And you know, she would say, if she were here now and somebody said that they do all the time, how do you live, you know, what's the best thing, what's the best way to support somebody who's got depression or got any mental illness? She said, don't blame yourself. Don't blame yourself, and also find something for you that takes you out of it. So for her, it's swimming. She swims every day. So I think we've both developed better strategies. I'm now very open with it when I feel a depression coming on. I never used to be. I used to hide it. I used to be in denial. I'm sure that back in my drinking days, a lot of it was about depression. You know, you go and have a drink, it changes your mood for the better for a while. And then when it changes back again, well, you can always go to bed and you can sleep. And then when you wake up, you've got a bit of a hangover. So that gives you a kind of challenge to get rid of that for a bit, and that might involve another drink, and on you go on the sort of spiral. You can cover up the depression. I would never have. When I was drinking, it's only looking back that I realised I had the sort of dark moods that I now have that I identify as depression. Back then, I just thought I used to actually think my hangovers. You know, I think my hangovers might have been depression.
Yeah, we've spoken before about the stigma surrounding it. I mean, I'd argue, I think you'd probably agree, there's less stigma now than there's ever been generally. And it's interesting to think how far we've come. I mean, you could not have written this book 15 years ago and maintained the position that you had then, or when you were at number 10 working with Tony Blair. You couldn't have been this open then, could you?
I don't know about that. Probably not. In that there'd have been more. I mean, I wouldn't have been this open then because I don't think it was my place as a spokesman, strategist for the Prime Minister. It wasn't for me to be out there saying, you know, I've got all this mental health stuff going on. But I was open internally. People internally knew that I had issues. I mean, I sometimes would tell my staff, like, I'm not feeling great today. You're going to have to help me do this, help me do that. And I think that, you know, let's just be honest about it. I mean, you know, Winston Churchill was a major depressive, and he had a bit of a drink problem. And people knew that. Now, okay, they didn't write about it and they didn't broadcast it on the television, but people knew it. Didn't stop him becoming, you know, probably Britain's most feted Prime Minister ever. And on the point about stigma, yes, there's no doubt that we're in a better place in terms of there is less of it, but I wouldn't be too complacent about where we are. I still think that there is massive discrimination in the workplace against people with mental health problems. I know there is because I have people get in touch with me, including people who work in the National Health Service. I met a nurse not long ago who said that she's never been formally diagnosed and she doesn't want to be, but she's pretty sure she's bipolar. And I said, well, look, for God's sake, you're a nurse. Surely you've got to, you know, she said, I'm just telling you, I know, or at least I fear it. If I was to admit that where I work, that would be held against me when it came to the next round of promotions. Guaranteed. That's discrimination. So I think that, likewise, you know, in the National Health Service Constitution, we talk about parity between physical and mental health. It doesn't exist. So, yes, we talk about it more and that's good. Yes, you know, you can be much more open, but I still think the stigma and the taboo is there.
But I suppose I'd argue the bigger challenge is less about the stigma now than just giving people the treatment they need. We keep saying it's important to talk, but encouraging people to talk about these things, yet not giving them somebody to talk to,
exactly.
Could cause a lot more could potentially cause more harm than good. Even with some disposable income, to go out and find a decent counsellor or psychologist. As I look out over West London now, it'd be difficult to find somebody decent who you're actually paying for, who you can see sort of 10 times in a row, let alone what you might be able to get through the NHS, depending on where you live in the country. We're a mile away from where we need to be.
Exactly. And the fact that we tolerate that is, in my view, a product in part of stigma and taboo. Because what stigma does is it basically says this isn't as important as the stuff that we do talk about. And I write in the book about when I was about 8 or 9, and my mum sat us around the kitchen table, and she told us about our next door neighbour. She said, he's got cancer, okay? And we were sitting there kind of, okay. And then she said, you mustn't tell anybody. That was the deal with cancer back then. The newspapers, when they wrote about cancer, they called it the big C. We didn't want to say cancer. And I think now with mental health, we want to say that we're out there and we're dealing with it in a better way. But your point about talking about it, listen, talking about it is incredibly important. And often, if you're ill, the talking to somebody, and it doesn't have to be a GP, it doesn't have to be a psychiatrist, it could be your best mate, but the talking about it can help. But I did a conference, Matt Hancock, when he first became health secretary, he did this big event at County Hall, a global mental health summit, and we were going to be world leaders. I mean, they're obsessed with this being world leaders thing. It's going to be world leaders in mental health, right? And he asked me to go and talk at it. So I talked at it. And when I got introduced, he basically said, it's fantastic. It's fantastic that we're all sort of talking about it. And I stood up and I said, look, I've got to be honest, I'm sick to death of talking about this. It seems to me we talk about it so much, but when are we actually going to do what we need to do to get us into a place where there is parity between physical and mental health? And I'll tell you, with COVID coming down the track, the book was meant to come out in May. It's been delayed by COVID. And I wrote a postscript about the potential impact of COVID. And the Royal College, I've written a piece in The Independent about this today, the Royal College's psychiatrists, they have said they think mental illness is going to be the second pandemic. You just think about it. Frontline workers and all they've had to go through, families who've lost loved ones and often haven't been able to say goodbye, children whose education has been completely disrupted, couples who've been forced to live together and maybe have found the cracks in their relationship unbearable and the impact that's having on their kids. Then now you've had the stuff announced today, universities coming back, and that's going to be becoming very tricky for the next generation of students. Then you add in the economic implications that are coming down the track. And, not for nothing is a sustained economic decline called a depression. And that is going to have massive mental health consequences. And the piece I wrote in The Independent today is basically saying, the government knows that's coming. Start putting a strategy in place which does involve what you were saying. Because if not, we are going to, I don't want to get too dramatic about this, but I've quoted in the book a modelling that's been done in Australia, where they are predicting a really alarmingly sizable increase in suicide as a result of the sustained economic impact of the pandemic. Now, if you know that's coming, at least try to put in place the strategies to deal with it.
But haven't we all got a role in, or whether we suffer from depression or not, but everybody, just like everybody should be able to tidy up a wound or perform the Heimlich maneuver or something, everybody should have a vague idea, some instruction on how to talk to people with mental health issues. Now, and that can be as simple or as complicated as you like. I mean, for example, lesson 1. Don't say you've got lots to be grateful for, because that's like the sound of a chalk going down an old blackboard. I mean, that it just makes you feel worse. But, what do you say? How do you communicate? We should all be sort of educated in that and coached in that to some extent.
Well, that is where I think that things have been improving. But to go back to the cancer analogy, if you're sitting on a train okay, and you're sitting there doing your emails, reading a book, whatever, and a woman gets on the train, she sits down opposite you, and she's wearing a hat, and she takes the hat off, and she's got no hair. Right. Now, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, she probably wouldn't have taken the hat off. Now she can, and she does. And you or I, we know how to have a conversation about that. We don't feel any embarrassment about that. And whereas if somebody comes on and they're sitting there talking to themselves, or they're sitting there looking away very quickly at, and seeming to react to things that we're not seeing, we get very, very edgy. As people, we think this is not right, there's something going on, and we feel scared. Now, actually, that person who may be psychotic, may be suicidal, may be chronically anxious, may be going through a kind of, some sort of psychological trauma, that person is far more likely to be a victim of violence than a perpetrator. But that is the reaction. And that's what we've got to try to change. Now, there's a thing, by the way, when you and I were growing up and we all did first aid courses at school. And as you say, it was about bandaging and all that sort of stuff. Yeah. Well, now mental health first aid is a big thing. You can do mental health first aid courses. The best employers are making sure that they've got people at every level of an organisation who do them. And you get time off to go and do that. It takes a day, whatever. So, we can all do that. You and I can do that. Yeah. And then we spread that word. But I think it needs leadership. It needs coordination and leadership. So you actually need a government to say, look, this government, the problem, I won't get too political because I know people are probably fed up of hearing me rant and rage about Brexit and COVID and everything else. But you want a government that actually says to people things like you've just said, there is going to be a real problem with mental health, the consequences of COVID. We all have a role to play in this. We government have to provide the services and build them up. And yes, there's a lot of gaps. We've got to try to fill those gaps. Business has got a massive role. And you, the people, you've got a massive role in this. Now, I think you could bring people together on that basis, but only if you recognise that there's a problem we've all got to work in addressing.
Well, I was very struck with your incident, I think when it was 28, when you were 28, one of your first psychotic incidents. You can give me the time exact, but it was just a particular kind word from a copper which saved you. It could have gone any other way at that point. But it was just something simple, wasn't it? It said, look, are you all right?
Correct.
Which on one hand was a fatuous question because you plainly weren't all right. But I mean, there was just something with the kindness with which he said it, which changed everything for you.
Well, it might have been because of the state I was in. I mean, just briefly, I've gone into it in a lot of detail in the book, but just very briefly, I was with Neil Kinnock, then leader of the Labour Party, covering his tour in Scotland. It was the weekend, I've forgotten this till Fiona reminded me the other day, it was the weekend that Olof Palme, the Swedish Prime Minister, was assassinated. So there was quite a lot of security around Neil, left-wing leader, And I didn't know who these two guys were. I'd got separated from Neil's party. I'd been trying to phone home, but I didn't realise I was in a council building. Every time I pressed the number 0, I was going through to a switchboard, and it was a Saturday night, and there was nobody there. So I was just ringing every number in my head that I knew: brother, mother, sister, home, work, everybody, friends, and everybody was no reply, and it was just spiralling me into this kind of. And I'm hearing all these voices, and then. The reason, when they said that they arrested me because I was behaving strangely, I thought the insides of my head had exploded. And it was like this glass flying around the inside of my head. So I was going like this. I couldn't understand why there was no blood on my face. And I was going like this, and my hands were like this. So this is what they were looking at. And then I started emptying my pockets, and I started emptying my bag on the floor. I don't know what I was doing. And I spotted them watching me. These two guys, I didn't know they were policemen because they were in plain clothes. I only discovered later they were policemen. And they walked over quite slowly, and there was something. They were about my height, and I'm 6'3", but they were non-threatening. And maybe I just reached the point I was ready to sort of fall into somebody else's arms and say, help me. But you're absolutely right. The way the guy said it, he just said, very friendly, very casually. He said, you okay? You okay?" And I just looked at him, and there was something about him, and I said, "Do you know what? I don't think I am." And that was the first time I'd ever admitted I had a problem. And the other guy then standing there, he said, do you think you should come with us? And I said, I think I should. I didn't even know who they were. And the next thing, I'm in the back of a police car. And I go, what's going on? And he said, we'll just take you down the station and we'll get you looked at and you'll be fine. And that was the, I was there for a few hours. I went completely bonkers in the cell. I was banging my head against the wall. I was chasing away these voices in my head. I thought I was getting schizophrenia like my brother had. I took all my clothes off. I was totally gone. And then the doctor came, and then I got taken to this hospital, and that was the start of recovery. So yeah, those two coppers, I feel I owe them a lot.
Okay, if you've got a question for Alastair, by the way, do feel free to start chipping in now. Just write them in at the bottom of the screen. In terms of how low you have sunk, I mean, you've been to a place there that I've never been to, and then what's shocking in the book is to read just how close you've come to taking your own life. Is it possible to put yourself in that mindset and explain what goes through your head in those moments? How do you justify it almost?
I've got on my scale of 1 to 10, where 10 is suicide and 9 is thinking about it. I've got to 9, I've never got to 10. And I don't think I've ever got to the stage where I am about to do it. I've got close, I've got to positions where I've had really, really powerful impulses. But I don't know, there's something that's held me back. And so what I do get, though, and maybe this is part of the coming back from that stage, I get into these very suicidal ideation states where, and I write in the book that particularly if I can't sleep, I'll be lying there and I'm imagining life after I'm dead. So I'm planning the funeral, and I remember, again I say in the book, I woke up one morning and I'd written this thing in the night. I've got this notebook by my bed because when I was doing dream analysis, that's one of the things I did with a psychiatrist. He used to ask me to record my dreams literally as soon as I could and send them through to him. But once I wrote this thing, it said, AC dead, short-term pain, long-term gain. And that really, I think, I get very angry when I hear people say, if somebody's taken their own life, and somebody says, God, they're so selfish. How could they do that when they had young children and so forth? But, I suspect that if you do take your own life, yes, there's the pain that you're going through, but I honestly do think that that person is actually probably thinking about nothing else but the other people. This is going to be better for them. I've been in that place where I see Fiona asleep, and I think, God, look at her. She's totally at peace. She's got a little smile on her face. She's going to wake up, and it's going to be me again with this bloody, dark cloud around me, and I won't be able to function. It'll be better if I'm not here. You get to that mindset.
Anthony Goodwin asks if you think you'd get a job as a strategy advisor to senior politicians now if you declared on your CV that you have mental health issues. Would that bar you now?
I don't think so, because with me, when Tony Blair asked me to work for him, he knew that I'd had a breakdown. He knew that I didn't drink, and the reason for that was he also knew. He knew that I had a, kind of quite volatile mood swings, and he was fine about it. And I told him, I actually felt responsible to tell him in real detail what happened in my breakdown. I told him, and I told him I was hearing voices and the insides of my head was smashing up and all the thing about the blood and all that. I told him all that. And he might have looked a bit, but he didn't worry about it. So I think you could, but it would completely depend on who the person was that was doing the interviewing. I can certainly think of a lot of interviewing panels who, if you suddenly said, yeah, and then there was that time when I was hearing voices, and I know they said, oh, that's it, he's gone. But I think, I think that when I in the days when I was interviewing people for jobs and stuff, if I see two identical CVs, same education, same degree, same interest, same the rest of it, and roughly the same kind of qualifications, but one of them says they're a recovering drug addict, or even, you know, they went to prison or whatever, I'm more tempted by them. I actually think if you've been through stuff, you know, what do we want from people? We want honesty. Well, that's pretty honest to put down that actually that's 6 months that in the old days you'd have said, I travelled, right? That actually was, you were getting cleaned up for drugs or alcohol or something. You want honesty. You want loyalty. And, you know, you get loyalty sometimes by that person thinking, he's going to give me a chance. He's going to give me a second chance. You get loyalty. And you also get resilience through that. You want resilience in people. And you get resilience if you've been through stuff. So I think...
yeah. Was there ever a moment when you could feel yourself slipping, but you were somewhere where it just couldn't happen? I don't know, you're in the White House or something, or you're in such an important situation that you can't let yourself have an episode. You've just got to crack on.
Oh yeah, lots, but I don't, and I think sometimes work can be a cover for it. But look, people might find this odd and interesting. May 1997, on probably the last 2 or 3 days before the campaign ended, I was depressed. There's an interview, if you can find it on YouTube, it's worth a look. We went to Sedgefield, the constituency count, and look, we knew we were going to win by then. We knew it was going to be huge. And we'd agreed in advance, Tony was going to do an interview at the count with John Simpson. And we got there, and Tony was having to deal with something. And so the BBC said, well, and I said, look, he can't do it. We can do it maybe later, we can't do it now. And they were like, but we've got the slot, and it's all da-da-da. And they said, would you do it? So I did it. And honestly, it's horrific to watch because I'm just in a total gloom. So John Simpson said, well, this is an amazing night for you. You must be very, very happy. And I'm straight into, well, let's just see, shall we? Results aren't all in yet. You know, not over till the fat lady sings kind of thing.
Yeah.
But I was actually depressed. And so I was working. I was doing everything I had to do. But then we arrived at the festival hall. And funny enough, Tony wasn't in that great a mood either. And I remember we were in this little room. And I said, God, I just want to get home and get some sleep. And he said, yeah, I know what you mean. Now, part of it might have been we're exhausted. There's a big day ahead and all that. But I know in myself that at that time I was feeling very, very down. And then, yeah, there'll be loads of times, but you just got to, yes, you do. You power your way through it. That's exhausting.
Somebody's got a good question here. So what responsibility do you think there should be, or there is, or should be on employers to identify mental health issues and support individuals to address them, particularly where caused by stress? I mean, I suppose there's two parts to that. What, you know, how much should they be doing that they're not doing as employers? But also, how do you know when it is too much pressure to put onto people? Because you want to push people, you want to get the most out of them. You want people really working hard. So where is the line? When have people got a right to complain that they're being pushed too hard? It's a difficult one.
It is a really difficult one, and it's like, you know, when I was saying newspapers, when Fiona was phoning up my editor and saying he's cracking up, that was because I was drinking too hard. I was also working too hard. I've always worked too hard, and that is one of my kind of aholisms. I'm a thingaholic, and that's one of them. So, but I think the way I think where we've got to get to on this is to persuade employers the truth of something that I think deep down they know, which is that even with the technological revolution, which is kind of transforming the way we work and transforming, you know, life for all of us, ultimately, if you're building a business and you're in charge of a company, yes, you can use all the technology you've got, but you're going to need people. You're going to need good people. You're going to need people who've got talent, and your job is to make the most of that talent. You're not going to do that if they're burning out every 5 minutes. And one of the interesting things that emerged out of the global financial crisis, a lot of the best work now that's being done, I think, in terms of employment and mental health and well-being, is actually in some of the, you might be surprised by this, but some of the big banks and financial institutions. Why? Because a lot of them lost people. They lost people to suicide. There's a desk at the stock exchange. I work for the Time to Change campaign, a mental health campaign, and they asked us one day. They gave us the thing of and thanks, by the way, thanks to Intelligence Square for nominating mine as a charity for this. But they asked us to ring the bell to open the stock exchange, and the reason was they'd had somebody who'd taken his own life, and I don't know if he's still there, but at the time they'd left his desk completely untouched. His desk was as it was on the day that he decided he couldn't take it anymore. And now I'm not suggesting that is, necessarily something you want, reminders of suicide, but at the same time, I think it's an employer signaling we take this issue seriously. And once you've decided to do that, that means you do have a responsibility to look out for people. And you also have a responsibility to understand that sometimes an employee is entitled to say, just as they're entitled to say, I feel I've got a flu, or I fell down the stairs and I broke my leg, they're entitled to say, I feel I'm operating under stress levels that I'm worried about. And it's your responsibility as an employer to take that seriously and to support them. That person will, back to the point about loyalty, that person will come back stronger.
Someone else thanks you for your openness and honesty and wants to know about your view on prescription medication. What have you taken to manage your issues? Could you come off them and avoid longer-term addiction to them? Would you think of it in terms of addiction, I wonder?
Well, that is a brilliant question, and I've gone into that question in some detail in the book, because one of the people that I've talked to is a psychiatrist, a very well-known psychiatrist in that world, and she's called Joanna Moncrief, and she's, I think it's fair to say, shorthand label, she's very antidepressants. And her point is that, yes, they might make you feel better, but there are considerable side effects, and she worries that they change other parts of the brain that we don't necessarily want to change. And I say in the book that if I'd have met her before I met my own psychiatrist that I've been saying for 15 years, I could have been persuaded maybe. But at the moment, of all the strategies that I've got to look after myself, one of them is medication. It's very hit and miss, and it's been very hit and miss during the time. I've had lots of pills that I've taken that haven't worked. I have lived with some bad side effects, but this one seems to work for me. And I find it very difficult to come off it right now. Now, is that an addiction? I don't know. I sometimes say to David, my psychiatrist, David, look, how long am I going to be on these things? And he will say, well, look, you're on them because you want to be on them and they make you feel better. I said, well, they might make me feel better, but what if I don't want to be on them? And he then said, well, do you remember what happened the last time you came off them? And of course I don't, but he reminds me. And he gets out the notes and he says, the last time you came off them, you had a massive crash and it went on for some time. What is the point of risking it? So that's kind of where I am now. I see my medication as one part of quite a big catalogue of strategies and tactics that I have to deal with my depression better than I used to.
Yeah, and yet there'll be times, even with the stuff you're doing about your physical health, your mental health, you're taking the medication, yet there are times you'll get up in the morning and on your 1 to 10 scale of how bad I feel, you'll be on the floor, you won't be able to move, and Fiona will soon know that. And I was very struck by a passage when you said that she will always ask, well, why? What's triggered it? And you will always say, I don't know. I mean, that's one of the hardest things, to stop trying to understand why, I suppose. Just accept it's happening.
Look, I totally get why she asked that question, because it's a perfectly human thing to want to know. She'll say, what triggered it? What she means is, do you know what triggered it? And I say, no, I don't know. And I never do. I mean, you know, I describe in the book a crash that I had in Scotland a couple of years ago. It was like a light switch. And I was really happy. I was like, we were having a great time. We were up in Scotland. Just had a really nice event for Fiona's 60th and friends there and family there. And it was like a light switch. Other times, it's a slow build up and I can feel it coming on. There's nothing I can do about it. But I can never say there's one trigger. Never. You know, it's not like you and I were talking the other day about, you know, football and the impact that can have on your mood. But for me, that's just a momentary thing. My big plunges, I don't know what triggers them. I still don't know. So that's why I've come to accept they're going to happen, and I've decided to deal with them in the way that I do, as a way of staving them off better, which I think I've got better at, and dealing with them better when they come.
Someone points out that we're both well-known, white, relatively privileged, with platform and influence. Well, one of us more than the other there. But some people might say your position don't really deserve to be top of the list for sympathy and care. Is that fair? Well, I don't think either of us disagree with you there. You know, I think that's why we're having this conversation, isn't it? You know, with our resources, I suppose you might say, you know, giving ourselves half a chance. But if you can't access the help, or even significant time with a GP just to hear you out, I just can't imagine how it can spiral out of control.
No, I think, look, I said earlier, are there people with far worse mental health conditions than you or I? Millions of them around the world, millions. Also, I've got to say, I don't want sympathy, and I don't want care. Unless I need it. I think one of the arguments that I put over in terms of the campaign for better mental health services, particularly for young people, is actually to prevent so many people coming to have to rely on professional medical help. A lot of what I have done for myself, I think I'm 63 now. I reckon I cost the health service less than I used to, because I think I use it less than I used to. And I think one of the reasons for that is that I've taken it upon myself to look after myself in a much better way. So yes, the psychiatrist that I see him privately. And I now see him a lot less than I did. I am getting less physical illness, I think, as a result of being in better mental shape. It's interesting, but I used to have this ulcerative colitis, right? And when I got it when I was working in opposition, and I was really quite ill. And bizarrely, Derry Irvine, who was then Tony Blair's right-hand man and shadow Lord Chancellor, Tony, who knows the medical world, Tony said, "Can you find Alastair a guy to sort of take a look at me?" It turned out it was the guy who lived at the end of the other side of the street. A guy called Michael Farthing, and I was diagnosed with ulcerative colitis. And he said, "Well, this is really quite bad, and it's quite serious. And I've got to warn you, it becomes Crohn's disease. And, you know, the chances of we can medicate and we can, you know, help it and we can deal with the symptoms." Then thereafter, I had to have an annual checkup. And a few years ago, we discovered it had gone. Now, the doctor said it was like an amazing kind of recovery. But I think a lot of that was to do with my mental health. Now, what do I know? But we do know there's a very close relationship between the gut and the mind. So it may be I've just, by working on myself in the way that I've done, I've ended up, I think, getting less care, and I'm very happy about that.
Someone's asked a question about how it impacted on you when you were at number 10 and whether you ever felt unwell at work but remained there. Now, you talked about the night you won the election. You weren't well, in which case you see the whole world as a black place. So how on earth can you evaluate whether a policy is good or bad, or an approach to the press is good or bad? If you think everything is going to shit, all around you, then how do you know what's right and wrong at that point to make any big calls?
Well, what I'd say about that is that I think sometimes in the workplace, if you've got my kind of psychological makeup, and particularly latterly when I'd already got to that place where exercise had become really important to me. So I was running to work. That was helping me. I was, getting in a better place by running to work. I had a really, really, really good team. I had a team of people that I trusted totally, and they trusted me. And part of that trust was that, as I record in the book, on one occasion, I called in my deputy and said, "Look, Godric, I can't function properly today. I don't want to do the briefing because I know I'll balls it up. I want you to do it." And interestingly, he said, "Oh, I'm sorry to hear you're struggling," and then told me about a member of his family who was going through something similar. That often happens. And it's not that you see everything as being dark. You don't. It's just that for me, when I get depressed in the workplace, it's just that I lose energy. I lose energy and I lose hope and I lose a sense of my own kind of ability to contribute. And that's why, particularly in a political team, but it's the same in sport, it's the same in the media, it's the same in any organisation, you need a team. And you need a team. So Tony, I wouldn't bother him, but he would pick up on it pretty quickly and he'd say, "You okay?" I said, "Well, I'm all right. But he knew what that meant. And, so I think it's about surrounding yourself. It's having those supports around you. And it's also about knowing your own strengths and knowing your own weaknesses and being able to adapt accordingly.
Lex says, at what point in the school curriculum should we introduce mental health education? What would you say to that?
At what point should we teach children that looking after themselves and looking after other people and how they feel is an important thing? Day one. And I often equate this to PE. So PE, you go to school and everybody is taught it's really good for you to run around, right? And to have a bit of exercise and let off a bit of steam. Well, I think we should explain why it's good for you. And I think we should understand that that link between the physical and the mental. I think younger generation are onto this already. And I think in terms of what we should do in schools, I think there should be a greater awareness of the importance to individuals, to families, to towns, to societies of looking after our mental well-being. Should be just part of everyday life in school. And far too much of her, Fiona knows far more about this than I do. That's her world, is education. But, I think there was that thing recently about, we've got some of the least happy children in schools right across Europe. Interesting, I noticed Albania came out close to the top. And I do a lot of work in Albania with the government there. And I think if you focus purely on outcomes, exams, results, league tables and all that, there's a danger you lose sight of the importance actually of the well-being, the mental health and well-being of the children.
It's sort of about the role of alcohol in your life, or not drinking, or drinking a tiny bit. Somebody wants to know if you get stigmatized when you tell people you don't drink.
Oh, well, I mean, there's some, I certainly think in this country, it's much, much harder not to drink than it is to drink. I sometimes do a thing when I talked about when I was running to work. I was never a big fan of our alcohol, the 24-hour licensing thing. I just felt it sent a wrong kind of message. And I can remember during that period, I remember once running into work from here. I live up in Gospel Oak. It's about a 4.5 mile run. And I can't remember what the exact number was, but I remember counting the number of places I passed that sold, advertised, marketed alcohol. And then adding things like posters and billboards and all that sort of stuff. And it was into the hundreds before I got through Camden Town. Now, so it's a very hard place not to drink. It's abnormal to say no. I think we've got to change that. Because I do think that, you know, if you look at what's happening on COVID at the moment, but what seems to be driving this kind of, you know, slight resurgence in the whole thing, it's basically socialising. It's bars and it's people mixing in houses. Well, you know, a lot of that's about drink. So I don't want to say, and the other thing about stigma, my son, I mentioned, we talked about Callum, my son, he regularly goes out with a T-shirt that says 7 years sober. You know, I think we've got to recognise that's an achievement. And actually, people who don't drink, they do a lot of good for themselves and for others.
I think they do. I mean, I'd always wave a flag for people who can moderate their drinking, because that's the one thing you can't do as a moderator. You can't say, I've been moderating for 2 years, can you? I mean, you can't have a second year anniversary of my moderation. You know, what do you do? How much do you drink on that night out? So I think I would argue we need to celebrate the moderators too. But I think what the question's getting at in terms of with not drinking, is it ever counted against you? I'm just trying to think. Sometimes it can help. I don't know, you're in the Kremlin or something, and there's some apparatchik who wants to drink some vodka with you, you know, sort of break bread and talk turkey and get the deal. I know, but if you're not drinking, can that count against you?
I don't know if it counts against you, but yeah, it can. If you that did happen at a time when there was some dinner with Putin, and these toasts kept coming in, and I literally was just lining them up, and you know, the Russians are looking at me thinking I'm being rude or I'm whatever. But that's another stigma, isn't it? You know, and I think holding something against somebody because of something they choose to do or not to do, I think we should, you know, generally resist them.
Okay. Listen, somebody has said in the audience they want to thank Fiona for a description of what it's like living with a partner who suffers from depression. Totally changed my attitude to issues I've been dealing with for 40 years. Listen, I want to meet Fiona. If I had a piece of stone and I had a chisel, I'd build a statue of her. She sounds absolutely remarkable.
Listen, I've had enough of this now. Like, she's a saint. She's a saint. But, you know, I went out for a walk today, I had two people stop me and said, "Oh, your Fiona sounds amazing." She is amazing. And I do think that's one of the best things, is actually what she can do for people who live with people with depression. An important part of the book.
Okay. Well, listen, thanks very much to you, Alastair. Living Better's the book, and it is great. And if you'd like to make a donation, we'd all be very grateful to the health charity Mind. You can click on the donate tab on your screen. And with that, I'll thank Alastair again. Thank you for taking part. Thanks for your question. And Hannah, it's all yours.